Hello, my name is Sean Speer. I'm the project co-director for the Ontario 360 project at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. For those of you who've been following this channel, we've been releasing papers on a regular basis focused on the question of a post-pandemic recovery for the province of Ontario and our country as a whole. And this week is no different. I'm pleased to introduce for today's discussion my project co-director, Drew Fagan, and we have a special guest, Senator Peter Harder, who has been thinking and dealing about these issues of economic growth, inclusive growth, over an illustrious career within the public service, where he was the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Department of Industry, Immigration, Treasury Board, and many other important files. And then in a private sector career where he worked with Canadian companies scaling and growing and trying to export into global markets. And so we're so fortunate to have his perspective, both from the realm of public policy, governance, and of course, that business perspective that is so crucial to a policy agenda around inclusive growth in the aftermath of this pandemic. And at the foundation of our discussion today is a paper that we released at the Ontario 360 project called A Post-Pandemic Growth Strategy for Canada. You can find it at our website, on360.ca. Where you not only can find that paper, but the various other papers that we've published over the past several weeks and months, focused on this question of how do we achieve higher rates of inclusive growth as we come out of this pandemic and try to rebuild our economy, our social supports, and ultimately employment and opportunity for our citizens. As we get started, Drew, let me begin with you. Can you just talk a bit about our paper, A Post-Pandemic Growth Strategy for Canada, why we published it, what does it tell us, why are we focused on this question of inclusive growth at this particular moment?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So this is actually the second paper we've done with regard to inclusive growth. And there's so much interest in a paper we had done with regard to the Ontario economy, and we have been primarily focused on Ontario, that we essentially decided to take the paper nationally. And we found something very similar nationally as we did in Ontario. And that was, Ontario or Canada are on slow and steady declines with regard to GDP per capita, and even more so with regard to other specific areas I'll get to in a second. This is particularly true vis-a-vis the United States, but not exclusively so. And I think it's important to note that we're talking GDP per capita, average. We recognize that at the extremes, this is a fairer society, but also we're becoming less fair. It may not be the extremes that we see in the United States, but over the last 30 or 40 years, we have been on, as I say, a slow and steady decline vis-a-vis the United States in terms of living standards. And if you look at other statistics, and this is true with regard to Ontario and the Great Lakes states, or nationally as well in the United States more broadly. And then if you look at underlying statistics that are fundamental, including R&D diffusion, corporate investment, business investment broadly, we actually are not keeping up with a whole series of Western countries as measured by the OECD or the G7 or other statistics, which starts to lead you to think about means of sort of moving forward. And this is particularly fundamental. In fact, various provincial governments and the federal government, I guess, have been talking increasingly about growth in the context of coming out of the pandemic, where we are again going to have fiscal challenges, and some would say a choice of tax increases or spending cuts, and growth is one measure out of that. But the way we have to think about growth needs to be in a different way than sort of the zombie Reaganism, to use a term that's been popped up in the last little while, of free trade, sort of low government spending, cutting deficits. We need to think more inclusively with regard to that and be more deliberate, which gets to greater state planning than actually has taken place over the last 34 years, where we were doing frameworks as opposed to being more specific with regard to that. And surprisingly, although some provinces have started down this path, Saskatchewan, for example, many American states, which is counterintuitive given the conservative of American society, have gone down that path. And we also have to be more inclusive with regard to what we're talking about as the means of ensuring fair, inclusive growth, which gets to housing policy, which gets to, in big urban areas, transit policy. It gets to childcare policy, given the She session. So being much more inclusive of how we think about boosting growth fairly going forward on a national basis.
So that's great. Thanks, Drew. What I think I'm hearing from you is a few things that maybe are just worth underscoring. The first is, even prior to the pandemic, we were seeing economic growth and other key economic metrics looking a bit sluggish for Canada. And of course, those have only those issues have only been exacerbated by the pandemic itself. Secondly, this idea that the way we've conceptualized the role of government and the different policy levers associated with economic growth have changed in recent years. Part of that is the pandemic, but I think some of those dynamics were already starting to manifest themselves, as you say, a greater recognition that the childcare, for instance, isn't just a social policy. It's an economic policy that enables women in particular to kind of maximize their human capital in the labor market. And so I guess in some, these issues that were presenting themselves prior to the pandemic with regards to, what is sometimes referred to as secular stagnation are even more pronounced in its aftermath, and Canadian policymakers will need to kind of recommit themselves to a growth agenda. But in so doing, start to think about the way that government can support growth a bit differently than we've had in recent decades. Which brings me to you, Senator Harder. You've been thinking and writing and acting on these issues for some time, and in particular in recent weeks and months in your role as a member of the Senate. Can you just talk about why you've been so focused on the question of growth and inclusive growth in particular in your work in the Senate, and how you think policymakers ought to be placing growth in the kind of broader context of considerations for post-pandemic recovery planning?
Thanks very much. It seems to me that the pandemic has been an accelerant for pre-pandemic trends. And the trends that Drew spoke about, and you as well, Sean, indicate that some of the old models, some of the old practices, some of the old sense of what the role of the government was, what the role of the state was, have exhausted themselves. That we need to, in a sense, refocus the levers of and instruments of the state to achieve a larger benefit for society, a stronger growth pattern, introduce some new areas of government focus, but also better alignment between the private sector and government intentions. That leads one to look at what, coming out of the pandemic, what are the areas that we need to focus on to have growth in Canada that can pay for the social and economic well-being we all aspire to. And that led a group of senators to say, we need a period of reflection on this to examine more deeply some of these economic issues, to take into account the need for a fiscal anchor of some sort, but also to perhaps reconceptualize the role between and among the various levels of government in Canada. And let me unpack that a bit. I think what we see emerging, your paper suggests that Monique Leroux's study of an industrial strategy for Canada is at the very heart. We need to have a growth strategy that is led by and articulated by government, but is not that of government alone. It's aligning the stakeholders, the private sector, the provinces, civil society, the institutions. Universities have become, I would argue, an essential ingredient of growth and innovation, particularly in certain urban areas and in certain sectors. So how do we align our tax strategy, our innovation strategy, and our federal provincial focus to achieve what can broadly be said to become Canada's growth strategy? And it seems to me that there are some aspects of this around which one could achieve a consensus. You've raised some of them, and that is infrastructure for the modern economy. And it's the infrastructure can be both that which is effective for the urban areas. But also, I hear a lot about rural broadband in these times, and that too is a growth strategy. Childcare, absolutely. You cannot have participation rates that we need for growth if we don't address the childcare needs of a society. We're going to have to do this in a way that's sensitive to climate change. So climate action needs to be reinterpreted as an instrument of growth strategy, not as a burden on the old economy, if I can put it that way. And my final point is we should be adjusting some of our traditional instruments of regulation and taxation to have a focus on growth. How do we use those instruments for growth? And I guess finally, I do think we're coming to the point where we need to have another grand bargain of what is the role of the government of Canada, what is the role of the provinces, and in some cases, the cities, and how do we choose sectors of growth and avoid companies subsidizing individual companies, and that's going to be that's going to lead to a new, hopefully, consensus around which our political class can engage the public and seek a mandate to deliver a growth strategy for Canadians.
That's just terrific, gentlemen. A great scene setter on where we've come from and some of the big macro questions our policymakers must face. You both alluded to it, so let me just ask you to both elaborate. Both of you alluded to the fact that as part of this renewed commitment to a growth strategy, we're going to have to think a bit differently than we have for the past quarter century or so about the relative role of government and the relative role of markets, that for a whole host of reasons, including changes in our economic structure, as well as increasing kind of strategic approaches being adopted by peer jurisdictions, that the conventional way that we've thought about governments and markets, I think, Drew, you distinguish between frameworks and strategies, is going to have to be part of post-pandemic recovery planning. Senator Harder, maybe I'll start with you, and Drew, love to have you elaborate as well. I think Senator Harder put it best. This is not government assuming responsibility for market outcomes, but thinking a bit differently on how it shapes those market outcomes. And so I'd just be grateful, gentlemen, if you both could give viewers a sense of what this may mean in practice.
Well, let's start with Canada as part of the shared economic space of North America. Ever since the Macdonald Commission, the government of Canada has been focusing on how do we take advantage of the North American integrated economy. And that has served Canada enormously well up to a point. And I think that point was reached in the period of the Trump administration, not just because of the personality of the president, but because of the limits of that common economic space. The use of tariffs by our partner, our economic partner, in a way that, frankly, Canadian policymakers never dreamt they would be used. And the America First strategies would undermine the benefits that we thought we were getting with the old NAFTA. I say this because I don't want to fall into the trap of saying, well, you know, the United States is a declining power and we got to get out of this common economic space. I actually think we have to redouble our economic space and work with North American strategies on, for example, the transportation sector, the auto sector. The reinvention of the auto sector is important for Ontario's economy. The reinvention of climate action and coordination of climate policy is essential for North American economic performance. And the building on the innovation capacity of North American, both private and public institutions, is essential for our economic well-being. But we also need to have new markets and be more risk-taking in terms of seeking those markets. I commend various governments that we've had for example, securing free trade agreements. But we've actually been pretty slow on following up with taking private sector advantage of them. And that is true whether we're talking about Korea, South Korea, or the European Union. But it is undoubtedly true with respect to the TPP as well, the Trans-Pacific area. And we need to be more aware of how our performance in global terms needs to take advantage of global growth, which is essentially talking Asia, and China becomes part of that debate. And that's a very difficult debate right now for very good reasons.
True.
Yeah, I just underline a few points there with regard to our international stance, and Peter makes an important point with regard to the fact that we've signed a remarkable number of free trade agreements that the United States, by the way, has not signed. So I can remember back 25 years ago when we started the idea of a free trade agreement with Europe, and the United States had actually started the negotiations with the EU before that. And they don't have an agreement. We do have an agreement. They decided not to take part in TPP, and it's unlikely they're going to go back to the table given the sense of priorities in Washington. Now, there is a strategic advantage with regard to, accessing the North American market from Canada, even if the new NAFTA is more protectionist. But the point Speer makes about the ability of Canadian companies to take full advantage of the markets that have opened up to them, I think is very well put. Government in some ways has been ahead of the private sector with regard to this. The other point with regard to the North American space, I think, is fundamental. Yes, there's got to be huge, astounding disappointment by the treatment of Canada by the last regime in Washington, and challenges with regard to America First buying coming out of the pandemic, out of the Biden administration. But at the same time, the advantage of being next to the United States and the size of that market, and if you look at the border effect that continues with regard to, you could make the argument that exports are more limited than they actually should be. So yes, diversification is fundamental, but our first market will always remain continental. The question, which goes back to our original part of the conversation, is how competitive are we in that North American marketplace? We moved, from the beginning of NAFTA, where we were exporting, our primary export was cars and auto parts up till around the turn of the century. Then it became energy. Now we face a situation in which the United States doesn't need our energy as much as it did, nor is there a desire globally as we, move in terms of our energy resources. What are we competitive in a North American space and a global space, which goes back to the fundamental question of being more deliberate with regard to what sectors we have natural advantage in and how government and the private sector can work together. We think of the private sector as competing globally. We don't really think of government as competing globally, and it competes just as much as the private sector does and has to work together.
I like that phrase, that term, Drew, deliberative. Another one that you hear increasingly in this context, talking about the role of government in shaping market outcomes in the name of inclusive growth, is intentionality. That we have a federal government and provincial governments that have, various policy initiatives underway, many of which are quite good. But in this new context of heightened competition, increasing efforts on the parts of pure jurisdictions to cultivate capacity and comparative advantage in some of these key growth sectors, I think there's an onus on Canadian policymakers to apply a greater degree of intentionality in the way that we're thinking about the role of public policy to support firms and capacities here within our own borders that can compete and scale and ultimately participate in global supply chains. And in some ways, Drew, I think that's where this idea of a growth strategy can be so effective in such that it helps to inform that exercise of intentionality and ensuring that across departments and even indeed across different orders of government, we're sort of pushing in a common direction in the name of inclusive growth. Senator Harder, you talked earlier about a distinction between some of the conventional policy levers and tools that we tend to think about when we talk about growth, and increasing interest on some unconventional policy tools that haven't necessarily been part of a growth conversation in the past, but are increasingly at the center of a growth discussion, particularly in the context of COVID-19. Do you mind just elaborating on this?
Yeah, sure. I'm very impressed by the work done by Monique Leroux and her task force on an industrial strategy for Canada. First of all, that they would be tasked to develop an industrial strategy is a presumption that was not necessarily shared in the political consensus 30 years ago. It was a rejection of an industrial strategy by government, and that they have come up with a sectoral approach, identifying various sectors where we have some pre-existing advantages, and then intentionally exploiting those advantages with the accelerant of various policy and investment opportunities. And this is not just a Toronto or a Montreal issue. It's a national strategy. So agriculture and agri-food, for example, would be part of that Canadian strategy, as would all of the ways in which artificial intelligence will itself be an accelerant to certain innovations and disruptive technologies. And how do we not only protect ourselves, but frankly take advantage of these technologies for Canadian benefit? So the whole notion that governments just sit back and do frameworks, I think, is past. The challenge now is to have governments act at the speed of competitors' growth. This is a first advantage environment, and we have to have jurisdictions that are nimble and able to have this laser-like focus on growth and not be distracted by other compelling policy interests to, in a sense, break through the competition. This is not a natural Canadian feature, but as your paper points out, our competitors, even in the North American economic space, have advantages that are taking advantages that we need to exploit for ourselves. And then you just add the dimension of the global economy to that, and you've got, frankly, bigger challenges.
Drew, do you just want to elaborate on the mix of policy tools that government may deploy in the name of a growth strategy or an industrial strategy, as Senator Harder talked about?
Yeah, and we're expanding the ambit of government in an era coming out of a period of, consensus, Washington consensus with regard to a limited role of government, going back to something of a post-war, consensus, perhaps in a new era, obviously. But there are also particular areas that are ripe for investment, given underinvestment during that period of the last 30 years, that are fundamental both in terms of competitiveness and in terms of equity. And we actually mentioned a couple off the top, and that was infrastructure and particularly broadband. The government has, at all three orders of government in Canada, been expanding infrastructure development and thinking in a more organized way with regard to coordination among the three orders of government, and in particularly, some complicated issues around policy making in an urban and a rural setting in which all three orders have to work together. And you can think of nothing more fundamental right now than broadband, to bounce off what Peter was saying, and in particular in the context of equity rural broadband. Because what's happened is, now the question is not, how's the, what kind of heat do I have? What's the quality of the water? It's fundamental. That's a given thankfully in most areas, not all, frankly, but in terms of broadband. And to participate, and particularly given, the gap, as you've written, Sean, between urban and rural Canada, Peter's point about the pandemic being an accelerant of existing trends, government has to be a lot more deliberative and a lot more aggressive in ensuring equity and what is new table stakes for full participation in the modern economy with regard to broadband. That's rural Canada, that's the north, and in other areas as well. And then infrastructure broadly. And infrastructure in an urban environment means transit, and the government has made a big investment in transit. They've been giving some thought to over the last 6, 7, 8 months in a context of thinking more holistically about the impact of that transit in urban. So coordinating it with housing, coordinating it with 15-minute neighborhoods, the new terminology, coordinating with community hubs. That means working much more intimately at the municipal level. So infrastructure, more, doing it better, broadband top of mind with regard to that one area where they can, or a series of areas where they are making an impact and will continue to do so.
That's great, gentlemen. So I think what we've heard so far is a few key points, maybe just worth summarizing. The first is that Canada has been grappling with slowed economic growth now for several decades, and the need to kind of break out of that secular stagnation is paramount in the aftermath of the pandemic. Two, that the way we think about the role of government in catalyzing and supporting economic growth is undergoing a shift from one of frameworks to one of strategies, one about enabling, the one to increasingly focused on shaping market outcomes. And then thirdly, that the kind of mix of policy tools that we tend to associate with the growth agenda is being rethought in real time. It's no longer merely tax policy and regulation and some of those big macro levers, but increasingly a number of what conventionally been seen as micro or even sort of soft economic policy levers like childcare, like housing. Drew, you and Senator Harder, you both mentioned the role of government in enabling and supporting broadband build out. So these are three big ways in which the policy consensus is being fundamentally reshaped in real time. I'd be remiss though, all of these issues seem to necessarily touch on the question of intergovernmental relationships and the role of the different orders of government. Senator Harder, you mentioned something that I'd just like to kind of poke at a bit, the prospect of a grand bargain to rethink the respective roles of our different orders of government and how they can work together in the name of a growth strategy for Canada. Can you just elaborate, please, on what that means and how it might manifest itself?
Yeah. Look, I think that the provinces are going to feel a huge pinch, fiscal pinch coming out of the COVID. For historic reasons in terms of the spending authorities. And the provinces are going to be keen to see areas of growth for their own jurisdictions. And the issues that we're dealing with are the same ones they will be dealing with not all of the tools that are necessary. So I can see the opportunity for a grand bargain on some of the issues around infrastructure, broadband, climate change action that is growth oriented, and putting in place the regulatory and tax frameworks that are promoting growth across Canada. And that requires not only an alignment, but in some cases, probably a greater integration than we have had thus far on in terms of policy instruments. It seems to me, at least, that the issues of rural Canada are not federal provincial as much as urban rural. And we don't seem to have the policy frameworks that grapple with that reality. And we probably need to have a rural strategy that is integrated across Canada, that is supported by provincial action as well. So I can see where a government of Canada could have as a policy option of actually, rather than simply saying we're going to do this by ourselves and use our spending power, but are going to say we will get to a table and we will provide greater fiscal support to a common growth agenda. And that will be the way forward for jurisdictions. It's not without challenges in Canada, obviously, but I think that there are ways in which governments can do that. I know that at the early part of this century, when Industry Canada was doing an innovation agenda, we actually had a signed federal provincial agreement on aligning our innovation strategies. Well, this is just a higher level of octane in terms of the federal provincial dynamic. And I think it's going to be essential if we want to be competitive globally. It doesn't help if we're last at the party and divided authorities that lead to slow action, if no action.
Drew, before you comment, may I just make two quick observations in response to Senator Harder's comments? Because I think they're so on point. And two things I just think worth emphasizing are one of the virtues of a national growth strategy is it brings clarity to the other orders of government of what the federal priorities are, and that process can be consultative so that the different orders of government have input into the design and the prioritization set out in a growth strategy. But fundamentally, it enables a policy conversation where we're singing from the same hymn book, so to speak. The absence of such a thorough strategy can make it difficult for other orders of government to kind of know what Ottawa is doing and what Ottawa's focused on. So, I think one of the virtues is this point of policy clarity. The second, if it's done well and it's based on empirics and rooted in the evidence, then those priorities ought to be commonly shared. Take the province of Ontario, for instance. If you were looking at the parts of the Ontario economy where there seems to be a comparative advantage or strategic value, I think most would broadly agree that advanced manufacturing is an area that we ought to kind of lean into as policymakers. Ostensibly, that view is shared by both Ottawa and the province of Ontario. So while they no doubt have various small p political differences on this question of supporting the advanced manufacturing sector in the province of Ontario, we ought to be able to get intergovernmental concurrence, and hopefully in so doing, build a intergovernmental agenda around supporting advanced manufacturing, and obviously that principle would apply to other parts of the country as well. Drew, do you want to comment on that or on Senator Harder's broader point about the scope for a kind of renewed intergovernmental engagement, in part, I think, probably spurred on by the experience of COVID-19 and the extent to which we have seen some positive cooperative federalism at play?
So that was precisely where I was going to go, Sean. So the term accelerant with regard to existing trends is absolutely relevant in the context of COVID. But one outcome of COVID, at least over the last year. We'll see in the future is the degree to which federal and provincial governments, territorial governments, municipal governments have actually managed to work together by and large. You've seen relatively little politicking given the stakes. The public had very little sympathy and willingness to endure the kind of typical politics we see on a federal provincial basis, let's face it. And you've seen a fair bit of coordination. Is there something that can be done arising out of that with regard to coordination? I think of long-term care, for example, which has, just a tragedy on an international basis, and was something that we recognized as a weakness in our healthcare system and had not managed to repair, and will have to be repaired going forward. That may not be something that you think of immediately with regard to the economic system, but it's fundamental to Canadian fairness. And, the equation that we're talking about with regard to, moving forward in a more deliberate way is a balance between economic efficiency and effectiveness and equity, new triple E maybe. And so, thinking about it in that context. So there may well be something to build on, because that's one plus that's come out of the last year, out of necessity, if anything else.
Senator, let's just wrap up with a final question to you. For viewers who follow the policymaking process in Ottawa at Queen's Park and who are trying to track the development and ultimate implementation of post-pandemic recovery plans, what are you looking for? What are your priorities, both as an individual senator and as part of the working group that you've helped lead and been involved in? And ultimately, how can we build the kind of consensus around this renewed conception of inclusive growth that enabled us to, as a country, as a society, for the previous 25 or 30 years to have so much success with regards to economic and social policy? I mean, in a way, the end of the McDonald consensus needs to be replaced with a new modern consensus that reflects many of the things that we've talked about and are present in the most recent Ontario 360 paper.
That's a very good question, Sean, and I think your paper contributes to the kind of discussions we need to have, not just within the government of Canada, but across the political players and all of the stakeholders of economic performance. In some ways, the pandemic has been a near-death experience for Canadians in terms of economic patterns, economic performance, the fragility of our economic well-being, and a recognition that whether it's a pandemic or whether it's the economy, it is truly global and integrated. So that reality is a proven one, and one that we need to have a franker discussion on what is our strategy going forward to assure ourselves of the growth, of the wealth creation, of the competitive advantage that Canada can have with the assets that it brings, and how do we work across stakeholder groups to be clear about that. I understand that governments have had to spend an awful lot of money, and I do think there's a political consensus around that. But we cannot continue with a level of public expenditures for basically consuming or the consumption of the well-being. We have to begin to be more disciplined on our investments and more focused on our competitive growth advantage. And that is a debate we need to have in an informed way. And I hope that we can take the politics out of it, but we also need to ensure that all of our political parties are focusing on this debate, not on some distraction of frankly, inconsequential difference. So the opportunity, I think, before us is ripe for the debate, and your paper, I think, contributes significantly to at least the policy holders in Canada coming to terms with this debate. But I do think it'll take political courage to engage in the necessary dialogue and necessary choices that are always difficult choices in a country like ours.
Well, Senator Harder, if policymakers are following the work that you and your colleagues in the Senate are doing, I think that debate and that conversation will be aided. We are just honored to have you as part of today's dialogue. What a thrill for us and no doubt for our viewers. I'd be remiss if I didn't observe, Drew, that many of the topics we covered today, rural broadband, regional economic development, fiscal federalism, are all subjects that we've tackled at the Ontario 360 project over the past several months. For viewers who'd like to find those papers and others, including this most recent one, a post-pandemic growth strategy for Canada, you can find them at on360.ca. Senator Harder, on behalf of Drew and me, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, Senator.
Leadership on these issues. And thanks to our viewers for continuing to follow the Ontario 360 project. We'll be back soon with a forthcoming paper on investment attraction, what the province of Ontario can do to compete for product mandates, for R&D mandates in this highly competitive global economy that Senator Harder and Drew have both talked about today. Stay tuned for that, and thanks again for your support for Ontario 360.